Hey, everybody, it's your host, Brian Morrison, here with a quick announcement. We teased that we would be doing the Seed Corn episode today. That is the RCAF personnel training in Lossiemouth, Scotland. We had a small technical difficulty with that episode. It is still coming, but it will not be aired this week. But lucky for you, we always have great content in the hopper. So today we'll be sitting down with Major Ian Wookey, who was the last Canadian in Afghanistan, as we start a 3-part series detailing his experiences in Afghanistan as it collapsed and fell to the Taliban. So with that being said, please enjoy the show.
This podcast is presented by Skies Magazine. If you're interested in the Canadian aviation industry, Skies is your go-to multimedia resource for the latest news, in-depth features, stunning photography, and insightful video coverage. Whether you're an aviation professional or enthusiast, Skies is dedicated to keeping you informed and bringing your passion for aviation to life. Visit skiesmag.com to learn more and subscribe to stay updated on all things Canadian aviation.
Fuel and ignition switches on. RPM switches set. TD switches normal. Doors and hatches closed. Lay down. Strobe light on. Restart check is complete. Clear left. Engineers, start number 2. Starting 2. Wind 310, Pilot Project Podcast, clear takeoff, runway 31 left.
All right, we're ready for departure here at the Pilot Project Podcast, the best source for stories and advice from RCAF and mission aviation pilots, brought to you by Skies Magazine. I'm your host, Brian Morrison. With me today is Major Ian Wookey, a TACHEL pilot on a CH-47 Chinook and Executive Assistant to Chief Air and Space Force Development in Ottawa, Ontario. Ian, welcome back to the show. I'm really excited for this second 2-part interview. Thank you for being here.
Hey, happy to be here, Brian. Thanks.
So listeners can tune into episodes 74 and 75 to hear about Ian's early career and time in flight training, which coincidentally, 75 actually airs today as we do this interview. And 75 is all about the experiences he had with 450 Tactical Helicopter Squadron here in Canada. Today, for part 1 of our chat with Ian, we're going to talk about his time flying with the 82nd Airborne Division in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, as well as the beginning of his experiences during the drawdown and eventual fall of Afghanistan. But before we get into that, let's refresh ourselves with Ian's bio. Major Ian Wookey was born and raised in Sarnia, Ontario. He enrolled in the RCAF as a pilot through the ROTP program at the Royal Military College and was commissioned in 2010. Following his commission, he was posted to 427 Special Operations Aviation Squadron and deployed to Afghanistan with the Special Operations Aviation Detachment in support of Op Enduring Freedom. In 2013, he received his wings and joined 450 Tactical Helicopter Squadron, qualifying on the CH-147F Chinook helicopter. As a member of 450 Squadron, he participated in numerous operations, including Op Nanook in the Canadian Arctic and multiple Op Lentis deployments to aid in wildfire and flood response across Western Canada. In 2018, he was deployed to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where he flew the CH-47F Chinook with the 82nd Airborne Division as a foreign exchange officer. There, he served as a senior air mission commander, tactics advisor, unit trainer, and battalion operations officer. He deployed with the 82nd Combat Aviation Brigade in 2021 on Op Freedom Sentinel, where he coordinated the retrograde of U.S. and NATO forces from Afghanistan. During the evacuation of Kabul, he flew as a CH-47F aircraft commander in support of Op Allies Refuge. Returning to 450 Tactical Helicopter Squadron in 2022, Major Wookey held various leadership positions and served as the Deputy Commanding Officer. He currently serves as Executive Assistant to Chief Air and Space Force Development in Ottawa, Ontario. Okay, so you were posted to Fort Bragg on an OutCan posting with the 82nd Airborne Division. How did that come about, and what was the process to get down there like?
The RCAF has a whole bunch of different exchange programs that are on different fleets, different aircraft, all different trades. And it's opportunities for us to share experiences, knowledge, gain experience with our allied partners on various fleets. So we have an exchange set up with the U.S. Army, where we have an American Chinook pilot comes up to us in Canada, flies with us at 450, and we have an opportunity to send a Canadian pilot down to the U.S. It just so happened that this specific exchange at the 82nd was a new exchange that had just transitioned from a training role at their training institution to a more operationally focused role with the 82nd Combat Aviation Brigade in Fort Bragg. I just happened to be again, I know we talked earlier, right place, right time, but was one of the volunteers for that exchange, and happened to be selected to be lucky enough to go down and do that. It it's a bit of an administrative process to do a posting outside of Canada, but it's pretty routine within the military. I mean, we're used to sending people overseas. We're used to having these exchanges. So doing a little bit of extra administration on the front end to get ready to prove that you're mentally and physically fit to go, first of all, is kind of the baseline administrative process to go through. The big difference is trying to figure out how to move your family, especially with this. Supposed to be a three-year posting was the initial thought. So kind of uprooting your life in Canada to move it across a border. Lucky for me, it's an easy drive down to the US. Other folks going to other various parts of the world, you're trying to pack your life into a sea container to put it on a ship to try and follow you overseas. But that's part of the experience, right? It was a really cool experience to be able to actually have that opportunity to go and learn from the Americans and to be able to share some Canadian perspective. There's only within the U.S. Army, there aren't a ton of exchange positions relative to the Air Force, for sure. And at a place like Fort Bragg, where there's 50 to 70,000 people living on that base, a good chunk of them in uniform with the 82nd Airborne Division, I think there were only 4 Canadians in location. And I was one of them, and I was the only Canadian embedded in the 82nd Airborne Division at the time.
You mentioned bringing your family down. Now, your wife is military. How did that work for going to an outcan posting?
We had a couple of options that we were assessed, had discussed maybe potentially taking leave of absence. Luckily, she had a couple of really good supervisors who she had at the time, who were able to offer her remote employment. So while she was there, she was working for the Canadian Army headquarters in Ottawa remotely from North Carolina in their training cell with the Canadian Army G4.
That's awesome.
So we both managed to stay employed and stay valuable to the military for the time that we were there.
Yeah, that's nice, because I have heard before where people have to take leave without pay for a certain amount of time. And obviously it's nice to be able to, stay employed, stay contributing to your pension, all that stuff for, a number of years, right?
Yeah, the CAF's gotten a lot better at that over time. While we were there, they instituted what's called the Service Spouse Employment Program, which is it's a formalized process to give opportunities like this, recognizing the unique challenges of being a service couple. So now we have a formalized process whereby if a member's posted to an outcan or some sort of geographically dislocated unit and the family goes, that there's a process whereby the service spouse can remain employed in their trade in a unit they know, in a role that actually fits their career in a remote setting, as long as that job's available to them.
Okay, that's awesome. So you were already qualified on the CH-147F Chinook, but that's pretty different in some ways from the CH-47F Chinook the Americans fly. So what kind of training did you need to get qualified with the 82nd?
Not too much training, to be honest. As much as like a helicopter is a helicopter, right? They've all relatively got the same controls aerodynamically. They fly a little bit differently. But as far as the Chinooks go, the Canadian Chinook that we fly, that was manufactured in 2013, is one of the more modern Chinooks in the Air Force. But it was also manufactured in Philadelphia by Boeing Vertical, and it's essentially the same airframe that the U.S. Army uses. So there are a lot of similarities in terms of the flight control computers. The way the aircraft flies is identical. A lot of the button switches, the engines, the FADECs, they're all similar. We've got some unique components on the Canadian aircraft. We've got a more robust electrical system. We've got a more robust APU. We've got the fat tanks, obviously, the long range fuel system to be able to give us 5 hours of endurance, whereas the The U.S. Army, you get about 2.5 hours endurance out of those aircraft. So learning some of the unique nuances of a different variant of airframe was essentially the training. So I did several hours in the simulator at Fort Bragg, followed by several hours in the aircraft with instructors there locally. But it was easy for it to be proficiency based, and I went down there with pretty close to 1,000 hours on the Chinook. So it's not like I was learning a new airframe by any means.
Yeah.
So I was able to pick it up pretty quickly, learn the differences, and very rapidly be able to transition everything I learned in Canada to just flying a Chinook. Right? It's not so different that it was cumbersome.
Yeah. Did they, if you talked about this anyways, when they heard about the upgrades we had done to our Chinooks, what did they think of that?
They were definitely curious. The Chinooks that we have they're also based on the CH-47 Golf model that the U.S. Army Special Operations uses with the 160th Special Operations Regiment.
Okay.
So it's the same kind of fat tank, long range fuel tank components that are on those aircraft. So a lot of folks were familiar with the 160th aircraft, so it was easy to kind of translate it in terms of those capabilities. Now, mission systems are obviously different between the two aircraft. They've got some pretty specific mission systems specific to their operational employment, to include aerial refueling capability, different radars and things than we have, which suits our Canadian needs more specifically in terms of different defensive systems that we have on our aircraft.
Your first large-scale exercise as part of an American unit was a Joint Readiness Training Center, or JRTC, Brigade Combat Exercise in Fort Polk, which is now Fort Johnson. This was a validation exercise for a brigade combat team of the famous 101st Airborne Division Screaming Eagles. Can you tell us about how this experience compared to large-scale Canadian exercises you've been on?
The purpose of JRTC was actually very similar to what was formerly known as CMTC, the Canadian Maneuver Training Center. That was the training facility we had out in Wainwright that we did a lot of large-scale joint warfare training through the 2000s and 2010s. The purpose of that whole area is to do large-scale combat, right? Bring a brigade or brigades into a maneuver area and allow them to fight against a proper thinking enemy at scale and maneuver themselves over terrain in a simulated combat environment to be able to prepare for real world operations. And these are located all over the world, right? There's a couple in the U.S. There's several in the U.S. The big ones in the Army are in Fort Polk. They've got one in California with their National Training Center, and they've got another one at the Pacific Training Center they've got up in Alaska. There's also ones in Europe. Canada's got their own. So they're familiar in that sense. The difference in operating with the U.S. Army is just the sheer scale at which they do operations. So if we're bringing a battalion of aircraft to bear in support of the 2101, so second Brigade, 101st Airborne, that battalion's worth of aircraft in a Canadian context is very nearly the combat capability of tactical aviation in Canada right now.
Wow.
And we're doing that as a small contingent of a larger combat aviation brigade that we're now moving down to Louisiana, bringing it across the country, which is another part of the maneuver, right? How do you logistically move a brigade minus battalion, depending on what your organization is, across the country to then get to the training area, to then actually be able to be combat effective and employ your capability, whatever that is. So in our case, it's combat helicopters, to be able to do that effectively, and then offensive maneuver, defensive maneuver, debrief the whole event, and then logistically move yourself back to your main operating base. That whole thing takes about a month from start to finish.
That's a huge task.
It's very high pace. A lot of planning goes into it. It's pretty rapid fire. The trying to live in as austere conditions as possible during the actual combat exercise, being mobile, being tactical, trying to reduce your real life footprint to be agile in the employment of your aircraft. So it's a really, really good learning opportunity to actually look at combat at scale. And I say at scale, it's not even in a large scale combat environment. It's you're not talking about divisions on divisions at this level. You're really still just talking about lower level maneuver units. But it frames your perspective on what it actually takes to be effective in that environment.
And that's just crazy to think about. You mentioned that you had, what was it, a battalion of aircraft?
Yeah, it was about a battalion minus. So we brought a company worth of Blackhawks, a company worth of Apaches, and a company minus worth of Chinooks with a headquarters. In terms of number of aircraft, we're on the order of probably 20 to 25 helicopters and UAS maneuvering around the battle space. Realistically, in Canada, 20 to 25 helicopters is the equivalent of 2 squadrons in one wing right now.
Wow.
So that's kind of how we have to frame our perspective in terms of how we fit into a larger fight too. And that's one of the benefits of this exchange, is to give people experience both on the Canadian and the American side of how we would fight together, how we would conduct operations together in some sort of environment, understanding the capabilities and limitations of each other's organizations.
Mm-hmm. So let's shift gears and start talking about your deployment to Afghanistan. Can you tell us how you first found out you're going back to Afghanistan? And for listeners, you can hear about his first tour as a second lieutenant in episode 74.
Yeah, the first indication we got that we were maybe going to Afghanistan was actually during one of the JRTC rotations that we were doing at Fort Polk. So we were as the primary training audience, the 3rd Battalion, 82nd General Support Aviation Battalion in the 82nd Cab. Our battalion headquarters, which I was in at the time, was being exercised to get ready for a deployment. We knew that the unit in the 82nd Combat Aviation Brigade broadly was likely to see a deployment in the next 12 to 16 months, and at some point, just in the way the Army was shuffling its maneuver units, we had some indications that we would be going to Europe, and then by the time we finished this JRTC rotation, we had found out, no, it looks like we're going to Afghanistan in spring of 2021 to be able to rip with 4th Combat Aviation Brigade, who was in Afghanistan at the time, starting to do some of the retrograde and drawdown activities over there.
So what was the role your unit was assigned for this tour in Afghanistan?
As the timing works out, this was kind of the end of mid to late 2020 when we first got the assignment, the mission. So we knew this was after President Trump had met with different world leaders at the Peace Summit in Doha. So we had an indication that it was nearing the end of the Afghanistan mission, and that any mission we would have over there would definitely be kind of like retrograde drawdown activities. And we were pretty sure that we would be bringing the theater down, helping bring the theater down to effectively zero, based on the proposed timelines for withdrawal. So as we were preparing for the deployment through late 2020 or late 2021, we were doing it with a view to make sure that we weren't bringing too much into theater, and that we were preparing ourselves to be able to operate across the country, because at this point, there were only probably about 20,000 people total across NATO left in Afghanistan, which sounds like a lot, but distributed across an entire country and coming down from the height of nearly 100,000 or more in the country, we were definitely scaling down the operations, and we were trying to figure out how we would, from a distributed kind of separate hubs of operations around the country, consolidate into a central location to be able to conduct retrograde in Afghanistan.
So it sounds like basically you had to almost plan to, it's kind of that classic do more with less. Like you had all these different tasks that you might have to expect to do across a much wider area of operations than perhaps would normally be expected of you. But also you have to bring the minimum possible stuff, because whatever you bring into theater, you can expect it's all got to come out.
That's exactly it. And it's also doing it with a view to the threat that's there, right? So understanding that you are not actively conducting offensive combat operations, but that you need to be prepared to execute that at any time. So it's a fine balance of being prepared to conduct full spectrum operations up to and including combat, while acknowledging that the actual mission task you've been given within that is to draw down retrograde and start to diminish the footprint that's there.
Mm-hmm. What was the workup training like before you left for Afghanistan?
The workup training we had was focused on both kind of the headquarters and leadership element, of which I was a part at the time. I was operations officer within the headquarters of 3rd Battalion, and the actual deployed forces that we're going to be using. So the aircraft maintainers and aviation support personnel that we're going to be bringing over. It started with a couple of small field exercises at Fort Bragg, a week at a time. Deploy to the field, shake out your equipment, run a couple of small operations from an austere environment, come home up to that Joint Readiness Training Center rotation we did in July, August of 2020, which allowed us to exercise ourselves at the battalion level, supporting a full brigade. Once we kind of had that routine in, like that was a really good exercise in actually, from a battalion staff perspective, how to manage a battalion, how to move forces within the area of operations, and how to, as I said, logistically get people from one place to another, acknowledging now that you're doing it in a simulated combat environment. So that was the preponderance of the workup training we had. Did we go into that with a kind of a fully fledged Afghanistan mindset of, hey, we're going to start doing drawdown? No, we focused on combat operations and offensive operations, because that's what we needed to be prepared for at the worst end of the spectrum, right?
Yeah.
If you kind of if you train to 100%, then anything less than that becomes easier. So that was really the extent of the workup training we had. The other thing that really played a part that has to be acknowledged this time was the state of the world in summer of 2020. We were just coming out of what was a pretty broad worldwide shutdown with the COVID pandemic. And we were trying to do all of these operations. We were trying to do all of this training in a relatively constrained environment because of the limitations that have been placed on us with COVID, trying to actually take actual real life force protection measures to make sure that we weren't spreading COVID throughout a mass organization. I mean, if you take 2,000 people and you put them in a 30-kilometer square box in the middle of rural Louisiana and ask them to all sleep in the same tent and work with each other on a daily basis, fight with each other on a daily basis, you're inducing a level of risk from like a health and safety risk in that environment. And that was well before there were any vaccines available, or before we actually fully understood what was going on with that pandemic. So that was another challenge that we had to face during that time, that kind of framed how we were able to prepare and how we were able to fight.
Yeah, that sounds like that would add a layer of challenge for sure. Like I remember at the time, just conducting flight training was challenging. So preparing for a deployment to Afghanistan while, being careful of mitigating the risks of COVID must have been extra challenging.
Yeah, it's finding that balance of what is valuable training and what is just risk for the sake of risk, right? Because we couldn't just shut down entirely. You can't just stop training. You can't just stop being prepared. Like the world's not going to wait for you when things start to go wrong. but you also have to do it in a controlled manner, acknowledging the risks that you're going to face and doing everything you can to mitigate those risks while still being an effective fighting force.
For sure. So while you were still stateside, President Joe Biden announced that all members shall be out of Afghanistan by September 11th, 2021. When you heard that, what were your thoughts on what it would be like to deploy under those conditions?
Well, I think the initial thoughts we had were, are we even going to deploy? It was a really weird time to be getting ready to go to Afghanistan through the early months of 2021. Initially, when we had been fragged to take over this tour, we were told that we would deploy as early as January 21. And January 21 came and we kind of got held back and said, hey, we don't really know how this retrograde is going to go. Like the forces that are in theater might actually just be able to extend their tour a little bit and be able to finish up this retrograde. And we may not actually need you to deploy 82nd. Like just give us a second. So there was a little bit of frustration in the in a bit of, hey, get on the bus, hey, get off the bus routine that we were in for a couple of months trying to figure out what the deployment would be. And I want to say it was March 21. It was either March or April 21 when President Biden made that announcement. And I remember being in the battalion headquarters, actually watching it on the TV while we were standing there getting ready. We were a couple weeks away. We had actually just sent the first chocks over to Afghanistan. Like the first group of CH-47 helicopters and crews were on a plane heading over to Afghanistan, and we're in theater already when we found out that, hey, the timeline is a lot shorter than we thought it would be, and the situation we're going into with now a deadline in place, which we didn't have before, right? We knew 2021-ish by the end of the year we'd probably be leaving, but when there was actually a time and date set that said, hey, this mission that's been going on for the last 20 years is going to be shut down, it put a little bit of a finer point on what we had to do and the rate with which we had to do it.
Mm-hmm. So this was your second tour in Afghanistan, but in a very different role. How did you feel about it this time?
I was definitely as excited the second time as the first time. You say a different role. I mean, the first time I had some restrictions put on me in terms of what I was actually able to do or see while I was there. I was super, super grateful for that opportunity to be able to go work in the ops cell and see what that deployed environment looked like. But this time I was actually in the battalion headquarters, part of the team, part of the leadership group that was actually able to go over and execute these operations. I was also flying at the time, so I was actually going to get my chance to go flying in the country. And as we started to bear down how we would distribute our forces across the country, I found out my initial job would be to be the detachment commander of the helicopter detachment that was in Helmand province in the southern portion of Afghanistan, and I'd be leading the last few missions of executing the withdrawal of the southern part of the country. So that was a really cool opportunity for me to take on and look at that as kind of coming full circle in the 10 years since I'd been there before, going in as somebody who didn't know a whole lot, who was seeing Kandahar at the height, to then actually getting the opportunity to close Kandahar in a Chinook.
So the time had come to head overseas. How did you actually get there? And did you bring your own Chinooks or take over some that were already there in theater?
As I said earlier, we were really looking to draw down. Like we knew that the footprint that was going in would then eventually have to leave the country anyway. So most of what we brought into theater was just personal equipment. In terms of the aviation that was there, we were falling in on the aircraft and assets that were already in theater, outside of a couple that were changing for maintenance reasons and whatever. But when we got on the ground, I think there were still about 115-ish helicopters spread around the country for the brigade, and we were working to then slowly bring that number down, retrograde from kind of the outlying locations in the country, and bring them back. So we didn't deploy with any of our own helicopters. We fell in on the ones that were there, specifically, especially the Chinooks, because I think there were still at that time there were close to 30 Chinooks still in theater, functional and able to be used for the retrograde operations. And that retrograde operation is very lift heavy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a lot of C-130 movements going in and out of the outlying airstrips. It's a lot of CH-47s going into some of the smaller places, because that's the only thing that you're going to be able to carry out pallets and boxes and a lot of just heavy, dense equipment, either in the aircraft or slung underneath the helicopter, to be able to bring it back to a central location to continue that flow, using Bagram Airfield, just north of Kabul, as the main staging base for those retrograde operations, where daily it was dozens of C-130, C-17s, C-5s, IL-76s. Like pick your favorite cool transport plane, and they were flying in and out of Bagram multiple times a day, every day, coming in empty and leaving full.
That's crazy.
CAF Outlooks is Canada's 3-day conference where the Canadian Armed Forces and industry shape the direction of defense and security. From April 7th to 9th, CAF leaders speak directly to industry on current projects and future procurement needs, with each day focused on one environment: Army, Navy, and Air Force. The CAF Outlooks series is presented by CADC, the Canadian Association of Defense and Security Industries. Learn more or register today at defenseandsecurity.ca/CAF.
So you were part of the General Support Aviation Battalion. What is that, and what is it composed of?
3rd Battalion, 82nd CAB, so 3rd Battalion, 82nd Combat Aviation Brigade, is the General Support Aviation Battalion in the 82nd Airborne Division, and it's really unique, I guess, across the division within the aviation brigade, because it's a composite unit. So whereas there's Apache attack battalions or reconnaissance battalions, there's UH-60 Blackhawk lift air assault battalions, the GSAB, the General Support Aviation Battalion, has a mix of UH-60 Lima aircraft. We had HH-60 Mike medevac aircraft, and we had the company of CH-47 Fox Chinook aircraft for the heavy lift, as well as some enabling units. So we had a deployable air traffic control capability that we brought with our Foxtrot company, as well as our supply and distribution and aviation maintenance companies. So there's 7 companies within the GSAB, which all have very distinct operational tasks, to include command and control with the UH-60s, medevac, as I said, as like a dedicated medevac capability with the HH-60s, and then the Chinooks. That's the only place the Chinooks are located within the division. So that company of Chinooks within the GSAB actually gets parceled out to support not just the battalion, not just the brigade, but the division as a whole. And even sometimes outside the division at core level operations, or or working with external groups that need that level of lift support to what they're doing. So it was a really cool opportunity to actually work within that. And not only that, for this deployment, we were assigned an additional company of UH-60 Mike Blackhawk helicopters to conduct air assault and lift, as well as a company of H-64 Echo Guardian aircraft, which had just come online as a capability for our attack reconnaissance support. So we were headquartering kind of a battalion plus brigade minus organization. When we deployed with the 82nd Combat Aviation Brigade with the brigade headquarters, overseeing the initial part of the drawdown just because of the scale. And then as we started to draw down, the brigade footprint collapsed, and we really just got left with our battalion headquarters in place.
You mentioned the H-64s. That's the Apache. How does it feel to have Apaches watching over you?
From a Canadian perspective, it's a really, really cool feeling to see an H-64 come over the treetops in front of you. It's a very capable aircraft, and not just for its combat power and its deterrent capability, right? But just the number of sensors, the amount of combat capability it brings to see and shape the fight when you're working in an air construct. The Chinook is really good at lifting things. The Chinook is good at carrying things. We're not good at watching things, analyzing that data, or pushing it back. I mean, we have sensors on the aircraft, but our primary job is to move people and stuff from point A to point B quickly and efficiently. The H-64s have the ability not just to, they're both a sensor and an effector. So they have the ability to see things, decide what those things are and what to do about them. And then they have the ability to put those rounds on target. And unfortunately, it's a capability that we lack in the RCAF, and have lacked for several years, decades. I really hope in the future to see an attack reconnaissance platform in Canada because of the capability it brings to the greater fight, right? The Canadian Army, if you ask them, I'm sure they'd tell you that they would love a direct fire asset that can actually see and sense the fight from more than just a ground level within its 2-kilometer bubble. The ability to actually look out several kilometers and put effects on target at a range of several kilometers is a really, really good asset to have. And even though, as we move later into the deployment, even though we didn't have them in an offensive role, to be able to have the H-64s with us, to be able to see the battle space, sense the battle space, and be able to push that information to us was invaluable actually later on in that deployment.
Yeah, it sounds like an incredible aircraft. And you mentioned talking about the greater deployment. Let's move into that. To give us a frame of reference, how many troops were still in Afghanistan when you arrived?
When I initially got there, April, May 2021, we had, I think there was the number that I had written down. I think there was about, as I said, 20,000 American and NATO members in Afghanistan at the time, and that number was drawing down quickly. I believe about half of those were contractors with the U.S. Army. Quarter, about 5,000 were American military, and then there was about another 5,000 NATO coalition military. At the time when we deployed in, the Americans kind of owned the south part of the country down in Helmand and Kandahar province. The Americans also had kind of east and central. It was an American-led contingent with the NATO mission at Bagram and Kabul, out in Jalalabad. And then there was the Germans were in control of Mazar-i-Sharif to the north, and the Italian contingent had Herat out to the west. So there was still a bit of a multinational flavor. NATO was also in the middle of its drawdown activities. So when we first got there, the combat capability across the country was present, but it was rapidly shrinking as we got in there.
Well, yeah, especially you mentioned that at the height, there was something like 100,000 people in theater. So you're talking about 1/5 of that now.
Well, at the height, I think it was close to 100,000 just Americans.
Oh, wow.
Notwithstanding the NATO coalition that was there. So yeah, it was quite the sea change from what I had seen 10 years earlier.
So let's get an overall picture of what your mission there was and the drawdown. Initially, you deployed to Camp Dwyer as the Aviation Det Officer in Charge, or OIC, as you've mentioned. You were working the closure of Camp Bastion, a major base in Helmand province, as well as Kandahar Airfield, or CAF, trending towards a last presence in Bagram Air Base. Can you tell us about how this mission went for you and how that process went?
I was really lucky in that the conditions were set well in advance of our arrival with the 82nd. Fourth Cab, Fourth Combat Aviation Brigade had been doing the retrograde mission for the better part of the year that they were over there through 2020. So when I showed up to the southern part in Helmand Province, a lot of the retrograde was well underway, and we kind of just got thrown in to do the finishing tasks once Fourth Cab had redeployed. So I think within 3 days of my arrival there, Camp Bastion was closed in Helmand Province, and then it was less than a week later that we were actively doing the closure of Kandahar and Kandahar Airfield and flying those missions.
You were actually the last Canadian on the ground at Kandahar Airfield, and you flew the last CH-47 Chinook on the day before the final closure. What was it like to see these major renowned coalition bases dismantled?
It was eerie. Like it was odd and fascinating at the same time. Flying into Kandahar for that last closure mission that we were doing, doing the last lift out with the two Chinooks that we brought in there. Flying in on approach, coming into Kandahar Airfield, like I only remembered it from the ground, right? I wasn't flying on my first tour. But the size of the base, and you could see all the locations that I recognized, like all the aviation ramps on the north side of the airfield were just empty. It was really a ghost land of basically a city-sized military base that was just parked in the middle of the desert. And it was very, very odd to see. And to be honest, a little bit emotional. Like, as there was an acknowledgement that I knew that I was going in as probably the last Canadian to see it. Considering the crew I was flying with were some of the last Americans to see it. And understanding what that place meant to Canada in terms of the military operations that we've been doing there since 2001. I mean, there was 12, 13 years of hard fought combat missions in that AO. And 160 plus lives lost in that area while Canadian troops were on the ground. To close that mission was honestly a little bit emotional, actually being able to see it and understanding the gravity of what Canada had accomplished there. And the realization that we weren't going to be able to have any more effect in that AO moving forward. So landing on the ground in the middle of an empty airfield, which 10 years earlier had been the busiest single runway in use in the world at the time, and just seeing it completely deserted was it was something to see for sure.
Yeah, I can only imagine. You think about the sacrifices that were made there, the countless lives that were affected forever by their experiences there, and then it's all just sort of coming to an end. It must have been really, really strange.
Yeah, it was strange is a good word for it. But there was also an acknowledgement that we were able to give the base back to the Afghans, right? And I mean, in hindsight, it probably feels a little bit different knowing what we know and how everything went a couple months later. But at the time, there was this sense of accomplishment that there was a little bit of finality to the mission, mm-hmm. and that the handover was being done, right? We were literally handing the keys back to the Afghans to kind of be able to take over the mission from the foreigners who'd been there for 20 years and be able to have a sense of self-identity and kind of like a sense of fulfillment in whatever they wanted to accomplish next. So it was heavy, I guess, was probably the best way to describe it.
Yeah. And you mentioned, it was always the goal, right? To, as you say, give the keys back to the Afghan people and have them manage security in their own country. And like you said, we didn't know how that was going to turn out months later. So it was a totally different ballgame at that point.
Yeah, for sure. And that was the goal all along, right? When Canada ended its combat mission in Kandahar in 2012, I think that was always the ultimate goal, was to be able to have accomplished something to improve the lives of the Afghans, which we absolutely did. So that it was nice to have that kind of like that experience, to acknowledge that I got to play a part in doing that final handover for Canada.
Yeah. Just briefly, what was the Chinook's task during these drawdown operations? Essentially just providing lift capability?
Yeah, it was a lifter. So it was moving a lot of the last equipment. So anything that we weren't leaving behind. So think more sensitive equipment. So communications equipment, IT systems, weapons and ammunition, any of the things that we wanted to make sure made it back stateside. That's the stuff that we were picking up and collecting, and people.
Yeah,
obviously. So moving the people back was a key mission, especially from those areas where we had limited availability for fuel, or limited availability for aircraft to get in and land. Kandahar was a little bit unique because we'd already given it up, and then I think it was the next night after I flew that last Chinook in was when they actually did the full drawdown and closure of that base.
Okay. So you moved to Bagram Air Base, now as Brigade Chief of Operations, or CHOPS. From there, you flew in support of the Mazar-e-Sharif base closure, the Jalalabad base closure, and helped manage aviation outflow from Bagram. What did this new job as CHOPS entail, and how did you balance it with flying missions?
Yeah, so the once Kandahar was closed, that was kind of the extent of our mission in the southern part of the country. So we kind of split the debt. At that point, half the debt did a retrograde from where they were based in the south, and flew back to a staging base in the Middle East. And we brought our Chinooks to provide that lift support. Flew them from Helmand Province up back to Bagram Airfield in the central part of the country to continue doing the drawdown operations in other part of the country. Once I landed back at Bagram, I was back into the operations cell, and that's kind of where my job was initially. It's always what I knew I'd be doing, and that job entailed doing the coordination of all of the aircraft operations. So any of the helicopter operations going on around the country, we were kind of doing the planning, coordinating, making sure we had the right assets in the right location at the right time with the right crews to get the right equipment out of whatever location we were closing down. And this was pretty rapid fire. I mean, this was late May, ended up going back to Bagram. And from, I want to say mid-May 21 through end of June, so that was a 6-week time frame, Bagram was closed. So over the course of that 6 weeks, we were closing down probably a base every 3 days in terms of the outlying outposts that we were going to.
Wow.
And everything was just flowing back to Bagram. So it was daily, nightly missions to be able to fly out into the AO, pick up whatever personnel or equipment needed to come back to Bagram, and then bring them back. And at the same time, we were actually coordinating the drawdown on the airfield. So not just doing all of the coordination with the external agencies, but how do we shrink our footprint in Bagram? So everything we bring back to the airfield, within a couple of days, it's getting palletized, marshaled, loaded onto some lift aircraft to then be flown out of theater to start making its way home. So the footprint on Bagram is also shrinking each day. So how do we do aviation support with a shrinking footprint on a massive base that's now only housing 10 to 20% of the people that it is built to support? So it's coordinating the real life support of how we actually flow people and things out of theater while still sustaining a capability there. And that was probably the most challenging part, was actually getting that sequencing correct. There was twice daily meetings to try and make sure that we had outflow sequencing, to make sure that we didn't, you you don't want to remove a specific force protection capability until the very last minute when you know it needs to leave.
Mm-hmm.
But you want to make sure that you have a plan to get, if it is, I use force protection because those are the most challenging ones to sequence, right? So if you have some sort of sensor capability that needs to be dismantled and brought home, well, you still want it to be able to function for your own force protection on the airfield until the very last possible minute. So how do you actually sequence that with other force protection capabilities? How do you sequence that with the people who are doing the force protection task and the assets that they have? So the vehicles, just vehicles to get around Bagram, it's a massive base. How do you flow vehicles out of the AO but then actually still be able to function on such a massive airbase with all of the stuff that's there?
Mm-hmm.
So decisions being made in terms of which vehicles do leave, which vehicles are then handed over to the Afghans who take over the base. So that's it. High complexity. So being in the operations cell during that time with how rapidly things were changing was actually a really exciting time to be there, and definitely kept me busy.
So just a huge challenge in terms of coordinating, maintaining a presence, but at the same time getting everything that needs to leave out.
Yeah, that is the crux of the problem that we were facing, is how do you get everything out? And knowing that we had that September date for everything, kind of period, full stop, we had the country. And then from that September date, in the coordination and planning, we were actually given more explicit direction by the commanders on the ground to be even in advance of that date. Right? There's a level of risk that comes from being on the ground too long with too little capability. So if you start to draw down and you kind of target a date that's broadly available publicly,
mm-hmm.
and you start to bring capabilities offline, and you start to send helicopters home, and now you're kind of sitting on the ground waiting for that end date. It just doesn't make sense tactically, right?
No.
So we were actually moving at a pace that really accelerated the drawdown of Bagram to a point where Bagram Airfield was actually handed back to the Afghan forces July 1st. Canada Day. I remember watching it from the CP.
Oh, wow. So we're going to talk about kind of an in-between period. Between the scaling down of Afghanistan and the eventual fall to the Taliban, there was a bit of a strange time. Can you tell us about this period?
Yeah. It was shortly after, almost immediately after I got back to Bagram, and we were starting to do outflow. We started to hear rumors of a kind of a small force that was likely going to stay behind on the ground in Kabul and not actually execute the full 100% retrograde of Afghanistan. And this kind of played out over the intervening weeks, where we were trying to figure out what might stay behind and what it might do. As this rumor actually started to gain form of formal orders, early June, we got an indication that we would actually be leaving a force of about 600 to 650 U.S. forces behind to support the diplomatic mission in Afghanistan. As things were moving along quickly with the retrograde, there was an acknowledgement that the U.S. wanted to leave options open to be able to conduct non-combatant evacuation operations, or better known as NEO. So what ended up happening was we were given orders to maintain, as part of that 650 person detachment, we were given orders to plan to leave about 100 to 120 personnel and 10 to 15 helicopters behind to actually help support the diplomatic mission and support the embassy in Kabul with any sort of tasks that they might need, whether it's just generic support tasks from helicopter lift, utility tasks, up to and including the potential NEO operations, the potential evacuation operations. So that happened very early June, and what that did was it reframed kind of my role within operations, going from, hey, how do we close Bagram as quickly as possible, to, hey, what is this force going to look like, and how do we support it from a U.S. Army perspective, and what are we as a combat aviation brigade going to be able to leave behind, and what should that footprint look like? So I started taking on a bit of a bigger role in the planning and execution of the transition from Bagram to Kabul. And what we had at this time was finally settled on 12 helicopters and 115 people to stay in Kabul proper once Bagram was closed. And we would co-locate ourselves with the U.S. State Department at Kabul International Airport, HKIO we called it. So it's the Hamid Karzai International Airport. So for, I want to say, kind of the rest of June, for about the 3 weeks in June there, I actually staged forward to HKIO to start doing some transition activities and operations with both U.S. State Department personnel and U.S. Army personnel and U.S. Marine Corps personnel, because they were located in the Middle East with the task to conduct the non-combatant evacuation if that was to occur. So we shifted the role to planning what that stay behind force would look like. So it was this all happened really quickly, because you think that's only 3 weeks after I got back from the south part of the province, and now we're kind of changing the mission again. Mm-hmm. But that's just the nature of deployments like that. So yeah, it was a really weird transition where we had to continue to plan to zero in Bagram, and we had to continue to retrograde our equipment, our personnel. But now we had to do it with a view to retaining some level of capability in theater, and figure out how we were then going to support a capability in theater at Kabul from the staging locations we had in the Middle East, in this case in Kuwait, with the force package that was actually staying forward.
So at this time, there was no inkling that the country would soon fall to the Taliban, and the U.S. was operating under the conception that they would still need diplomats in Afghanistan?
So I don't think there was, I don't want to suggest that there was no indications, right? As we look at the security situation as it was moving through in June and July, it was very obviously deteriorating, especially within the country. Like we knew the intelligence reports that were coming in, and we knew that the Afghan National Defense Force was having trouble at some of its locations maintaining security posture in the AO.
Okay.
We knew that district centers were coming under Taliban control. So I don't want to characterize it as no inkling, but at the same time, what the U.S. wasn't going to do was completely abandon the country, right? They knew that they wanted to maintain a diplomatic presence in the country. So that would come with some risk, but Kabul at the time was deemed to be a safe location. We still had control of the city. We still had control of the airfield. NATO was still present. Like we did still have a couple of coalition partners in location. The mission would shrink, but it was never really going to go away until there was a decision made that the diplomatic mission. So the military mission was closing. We knew that the retrograde was going to occur, and that target date of September 11th was always there. But from a State Department type of mission, there was no indication that the Americans were just going to leave Afghanistan entirely, and they wanted to retain diplomatic support through an embassy, both to make sure that American citizens were looked after while they were there. And these were plans that I want to say all partner nations had. Like we didn't get any indication at that time that any of the missions that had open embassies in Kabul would be closing or shutting down completely. A lot of them were talking about drawing down, and maybe they were looking forward to plans, but the planning horizon that we were looking at with the diplomatic force was we wanted to be postured to be able to support the diplomatic mission or a non-combatant evacuation operation potentially out to the end of the calendar year. So we were looking at a planning horizon that was kind of October, December 2021. Whereas the retrograde of the military operation and the return of Bagram to the Afghan forces was still targeted for that September 11th deadline, which ended up being July 1st.
So very, very complex situation at that time.
Yeah, complex situation both in planning and security, right? Everything we had to do had to be with an acknowledgement of the security situation that we had, but we also had orders from the President of the United States that said the military missions could be closed, right? So we also weren't setting up for a combat mission.
Right.
We were looking at re-rolling. If in this case we were operating, I think, under a Title 11 mission, which was a combat operation to include counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan. The U.S. was looking at re-rolling, I think, to a Title 22, which was going to be contingency operations only, right, in support of the diplomatic mission. So the policy and government direction that we were being given was to cease military operations and to allow that transition to operations with the Afghan forces, while still retaining the flexibility to be an effective diplomatic force in Kabul.
Okay.
Right. So the initial indication we got to when we left that contingent behind on the aviation side, for sure, our mission was going to be pretty low key, right? We weren't necessarily going to be there to be the main show in town. We were going to be there as a contingency force, a support force, just a little bit of extra capacity to make sure that the diplomats that were there and the State Department folks doing their job had the support that they needed.
Okay.
So that's kind of what happened with that force. We were a force of 110 to 120 with the aviation detachment that stayed behind. There was another 200 to 250-ish soldiers from 10th Mountain, basically two infantry companies, which stayed behind to do force protection. We had a fires, kind of like a counter rocket and mortar det that was going to stay back to do force protection on the airfield. We had a couple of small explosive ordnance disposal teams, and that was about the extent of it, right? We only that made up about the 600 and 650 U.S. conventional forces that remained in Afghanistan after the closure of Bagram.
And other than that, it was the Afghan National Defense Force who were providing security for the country.
Yeah, security for the country at large. That was the mission.
Yeah.
I should also mention that we did, as I said, we still had NATO partners with us in Kabul at the time, and we did have some Turkish forces who were providing additional force protection on the airfield, as well as the Norwegians were still running the medical facility there.
Okay. Did you have faith that the Afghans would be able to maintain stability in the country? You personally?
I was getting the same intelligence reports as everybody else who was in there. So I tried to maintain a clear-eyed assessment that things were not going well.
Okay.
Did I know how quickly things were going to transition? I don't think anybody foresaw the rate at which things were going to deteriorate, but we all knew that the situation was not improving.
Okay.
We all knew that the Taliban were taking a hold in different parts of the country. We knew that district centers were falling. We knew that provincial capitals were at risk. And as we moved through the weeks, through kind of late June, mid July, you really got a sense that things were not going well. I don't think anybody could have foreseen what eventually happened in the middle of August, happening that rapidly. But we knew that we were in a deteriorating security situation and that things were going to change where we were.
Yeah. Okay, Ian, that's where we're going to end this part. But listeners can join us next week for part 2, where we will pick back up. I want to thank you so much again for being on the show, for taking the time to be here, especially with your new, very busy schedule. And I am really looking forward to chatting again with you.
Thanks, Brian. It's been a pleasure. I'm really happy to be able to share this with you.
Great. Okay, that wraps up part 1 of our chat with Ian Wookey about his experiences as the last Canadian in Afghanistan. Tune in next week for part 2 of our 3-part series as we continue with the story. Do you have any questions or comments about anything you've heard in this show? Would you or someone you know make a great guest, or do you have a great idea for a show? You can reach out to us at thepilotprojectpodcast@gmail.com or on all social media at @podpilotproject. And be sure to check out that social media for lots of great videos of our RCAF and mission aviation aircraft. As always, we'd like to thank you for tuning in and ask for your help with the big 3. That's like and follow us on social media, share with your friends, and follow and rate us 5 stars wherever you get your podcasts. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. Keep the blue side up. See ya!
Engineer, shut down all 4.
Shutting down all 4 engines.